I've always been skeptical about the claim that money can buy happiness. It always sounded like something that poor people say to make themselves feel better about being poor. As an average broke person, myself living in a developed country, it seemed undeniable, at least to me, that the majority, if not all of my problems can be solved with money. So surely having lots of money will make me happy. As a result of my recent research into dopamine and how it operates in our brain, I changed my mind on the subject. What I discovered was that dopaminergic processes in human nervous system provides a definitive proof based on first principle that it is biologically impossible to use money to buy happiness. Specifically, there are 3 dopaminergic processes that contribute to this conclusion, and that's what I'm going to share in this video. The first of these processes is something I call the recent history of dopamine. Dopamine, as you probably know, is a neuromodulator that is commonly known for making us feel happiness and pleasure, but the reality is more nuanced than that. For example, a constant level of dopamine in our brain doesn't make us feel happy, it just makes us feel normal. It is the changes in dopamine level that makes us feel happy or sad. For example, an increase in dopamine level makes us feel happy, while a decrease makes us feel sad. And this increase or decrease is relative to what your dopamine level was moments before. So whether an experience makes us happy depends not only on how much dopamine release this event would trigger, but also the recent historical level of dopamine, or how much dopamine you had in your system just before the event happened. So if your dopamine level is already very high to begin with, for whatever reason, maybe you just won an award or you just made a lot of money, it is very hard at that point for you to experience any additional pleasure or happiness, because in order for you to experience any additional pleasure or happiness, you must experience stimuli that would make your dopamine level go even higher. A realistic example that we see sometimes will be a rich guy trying to buy happiness by buying experiences that trigger the release of dopamine. And because happiness can only be felt when the new experience spikes up dopamine to an even higher level than the previous experience did, the rich guy has to buy more and more extravagant experiences. So for example, when he started out, a nice dinner might have been enough to make him happy. After a few months of extravagance, he might need to start buying jets and mansions and Bugattis. But now it seems like money could in fact buy happiness so long as you buy more and more extravagant things. But that approach has 2 limitations. The first limitation is an obvious one as it relates to the law of physics, which is that eventually the rich guy will run out of interesting things to buy. But even if we assume that this rich guy has a magic wand that breaks the law of physics and generates increasingly interesting things for him in a limitless fashion, eventually the rich guy would run into the second limitation, which relates to the second dopaminergic process. And this is where, despite the unending insertion of bigger and better experiences, the amount of dopamine increase from these experiences will become less and less and eventually flatline. And this is because the amount of dopamine we have in our brain is in a way finite. And this dopaminergic process is what Andrew Huberman calls
the readily releasable pool of dopamine.
How this works is that dopamine is released from synaptic vesicles, which are virtually storage spaces for dopamine that can be released into the nervous system. Certain experiences trigger the release of dopamine from this pool and makes us feel happy. But once all the dopamine in this pool has been released, our brain will not be able to release any more dopamine until our brain naturally replenish these synaptic vesicles after some time passes. So even when the rich guy with the magic wand is able to conjure more and more dopamine releasing experiences, he will eventually deplete the dopamine from the releasable pool. And at that point, he has essentially run out of dopamine to release. So no amount of pleasureful experiences will trigger any additional spike in his dopamine level. So no matter how he waves his wand, he won't be happier. And this is where the story takes a more sinister turn, where the last dopaminergic mechanism starts to kick in, something that Dr. Anna Lembke calls the pleasure-pain balance. How this works is you have a baseline of dopamine, and occasionally experience happen to you that trigger a peak above your dopamine baseline, but your dopamine won't stay at the higher level forever, and it will eventually come down. And when it comes down, it doesn't just come down to the same level as your previous baseline, but it goes down to a level below your previous baseline and stay there for some time while your brain replenishes the synaptic vesicles before your dopamine level returns to your previous baseline. And the degree to which your dopamine dips below baseline is proportional to how high the peak was. And just like how the peak above baseline feels like pleasure, the dip below baseline feels like pain. So in a way, the more pleasure you experience, the more pain you will experience. And this presents quite a conundrum for rich people because while they can afford more extravagant and interesting way to spike dopamine, every time they do that, they have to experience a proportional amount of pain. So here we start to understand why money can buy happiness from a dopaminergic perspective. If we inspect each part of the dopaminergic process to see which part money can directly affect, we see that money can't buy more dopamine directly. It can buy a higher dopamine baseline. It can buy more releasable dopamine, and it can make the brain replenish the releasable pool of dopamine faster once it has been depleted. So the only dopaminergic element money can directly affect is essentially the opportunities to release more dopamine, which are the pleasureful experiences that money can procure. But for every peak that these experiences produce, the individual must pay later with a proportional amount of pain where the dopamine level dips back below baseline. So the peaks cancel out the valleys, and if you average that out, the rich guy is just as happy as the poor guy on average. And if you further inspect the claim that rich people can afford more dopamine releasing opportunities, you might start to realize that that's not really an advantage, because it's not like there is a general scarcity of dopamine releasing opportunities. If you're an average person living in a developed country, or anyone who has the technological access and the free attention to watch this video, you probably already have access to more dopamine releasing opportunities than you have dopamine to release. For example, just TikTok alone might be enough to make your brain release so much dopamine that it throws off the neurochemical balance in your brain. And that's just one app in one device that you have access to. In my experience, on average, people don't really have a scarcity of dopamine releasing opportunities. Rather, it's the opposite. The problem average people seem to face today is an overabundance of opportunities to release dopamine, so much so that it's messing up people's dopaminergic functioning, leading to things like depression, lack of motivation, short attention span, so on and so forth. So if having such an overabundance of dopamine releasing opportunities isn't making you happy while you're broke, becoming rich and acquiring even more dopamine releasing opportunities obviously isn't going to make you happier. Although that looks like conclusive proof that money can buy happiness, it isn't the full story. This is because in order to explain why money can buy happiness, you must explain what is happiness and what makes people happy. And that's a much bigger discussion, of which dopaminergic processes is a small part. And explaining everything about happiness is beyond the scope of this video, and is frankly beyond my abilities. But I do hope from a dopaminergic perspective, at least, that this video is able to provide a clear explanation as to why money alone can't make you happy. And I hope that this inspires you to review the assumptions by which you organize your priorities, so that you don't live a life that's solely fixated on money if that's not what you want to do.